What if everything you were taught about Jesus' death is incomplete, or even manipulated? What if the idea that Jesus died for sin is not the whole truth, but just a carefully selected part of a much deeper, older, and perhaps much more disturbing story? Stop for a moment and think, why has this narrative been repeated for centuries without question? Why do millions believe that Jesus' sacrifice had only one purpose, when there is evidence that his mission may have been much greater? Now imagine this. What if Jesus didn't just come to die for the sins of humanity, but to expose something that was hidden from the beginning, something that few dared to question, something that involves the God of the Old Testament himself? This possibility may sound shocking, even uncomfortable, but that's exactly what makes this revelation so powerful. Because when you start to look deeper, some pieces just don't fit together. The traditional narrative tells us that Jesus came as a lamb, as a sacrifice, as redemption. But what if this is just the surface? What if behind this story there is a hidden mission, a revelation that has been silenced, distorted, or even hidden over the centuries? Many scholars, ancient texts, and spiritual currents point to something intriguing: the existence of so-called Archons, entities that, according to some traditions, influence spiritual reality and even humanity's perception of God. And this is where it all starts to get even more intense, because some of these interpretations suggest that the God presented in the Old Testament may not be exactly what he seems. Is a God who punishes, who demands absolute obedience, who rules by fear, really the same loving Father that Jesus described? Or is there a difference that has never been fully explained? If Jesus came to reveal the truth, then why are so many of these issues never discussed openly? Why were certain texts deleted, ignored, or considered too dangerous for the public? Has the Church, throughout history, protected the faith or controlled the narrative? This is a question that can completely change the way you see everything. And here's the most intriguing point. If Jesus really came to expose something, not just to save, then his death may have had a much deeper meaning than we've been taught. Not just a sacrifice, but a confrontation. Not just redemption, but revelation, an attempt to show humanity that there is something beyond what has been presented, something that needs to be seen, understood, and questioned. And if this truth was hidden, who decided that, and why? Before continuing, I want to ask you a direct question. Are you willing to question everything you've always believed? Because what you discover from here may challenge not just religious concepts, but the very basis of your faith. If this type of content makes sense to you, leave your comment now. I want to know the truth. This helps spread this message to more people who are also looking for answers. And that's exactly why this moment is so important, because it's not just about information, it's about spiritual discernment. If there is something that has been hidden, distorted, or misinterpreted over the centuries, then we are not just facing a curious topic. We are facing something that can directly impact your faith, your view of Jesus, and even the way you connect with God. But before we go even deeper into this revelation, I want to stop for a few seconds and do something different with you, something that goes beyond knowledge, something spiritual, because it's no use just listening. You need to feel, seek, and position yourself. If you believe there is more to this story, if you feel you need clarity, direction, or even spiritual protection at this time, write your prayer request now in the comments. It could be for you, your family, your spiritual life, or any area of your life that needs divine intervention. We will pray for you. Yes, this community is not just about knowledge, it is about spiritual connection. Many people who watch these videos are going through doubts, internal conflicts, difficult times, and when we come together in prayer, something powerful happens. So don't ignore this moment. Write your request, even if it's simple. God sees, God hears, and we will be in this together. And while you're doing that, leave your like on this video, because this helps this message reach more people who are also looking for answers, who are also questioning, and who need to hear what they may never have had the courage to say to themselves. Subscribe to the channel now, because what you're seeing here is not ordinary content. We are exploring mysteries, revelations, and truths that are often not discussed openly. And if you don't subscribe, YouTube may simply not show you upcoming videos, and you may miss out on exactly the most important part of this journey. And there's something you need to understand. What we're starting here is just the beginning, because from now on we are going to enter an even deeper level, where we will begin to analyze evidence, texts, patterns, and signs that may indicate that Jesus' mission went far beyond what we were taught. We'll look at details that go unnoticed, words that seem common but carry hidden meanings, and connections that, when revealed, completely change the way you see everything. So get ready, because what comes next isn't just theory. It's pieces of a puzzle that start to fall into place. And once that happens, there's no going back. What if Jesus didn't just die for sins, but to expose an entity hidden in Scripture? I know this question can cause a certain discomfort, because it directly confronts everything that has been repeated for years, perhaps throughout your life. But think with me for a moment. Without rushing, without fear, what if the narrative that Jesus died for sin is just the surface of something much deeper? Something that wasn't fully revealed, or maybe wasn't allowed to be revealed? Because when you start looking closely at Jesus' own teachings, some things start to sound different. He didn't just talk about forgiveness, and he talked about truth. He didn't just talk about salvation, he talked about liberation. And liberation from what exactly? From sin, or from something bigger, more invisible, more difficult to perceive? Now comes a concept that is almost never discussed openly, the so-called Archons. Maybe you've never heard this word, or maybe you've seen it superficially. But within some ancient traditions, especially in texts considered forbidden or excluded, Archons are described as spiritual entities that exercise dominion, control, and even influence over the way humanity sees spiritual reality. And if that's true, that changes everything. Because now the question stops being just, did Jesus die for sins? And becomes, did Jesus come to expose who or what was behind this system? And here is where the conflict starts to become more evident. When you compare certain characteristics attributed to the God of the Old Testament with what Jesus taught, there is a tension that many prefer to ignore. A God who demands constant sacrifices, who rules by fear, who punishes severely, seems very different from the loving, merciful, and compassionate Father Jesus describes. Are we talking about exactly the same source? Or is there something that has never been fully clarified? What if Jesus realized this? What if his mission was not just to reconcile humanity with God, but to reveal that their own perception of God was distorted? That would explain a lot of things. It would explain why Jesus constantly confronted religious authorities. It would explain why his words were seen as dangerous. It would explain why he spoke in parables, as if he were trying to say something that not everyone was prepared to understand. Because maybe he was revealing something that needed to be protected from superficial interpretations. Now think deeper. If there is an entity, a system, or a force that benefits from the spiritual control of humanity, it would make sense to keep people focused on only one part of the truth, wouldn't it? It would make sense to reinforce a single narrative, with no room for questioning, no room for deeper investigation, because whoever starts to question starts to see, and those who see can no longer be controlled in the same way. And this is exactly where everything begins to connect with a possible hidden mission of Jesus. Not just die, but expose. Not just save, but reveal. Not just teaching, but breaking structures that had been rooted for centuries. But then another inevitable question arises. If this is true, why does almost no one talk about it? Why are these concepts not taught openly? Why were certain texts left out? Why are some ideas immediately labeled as dangerous or heretical? Is it just to protect faith, or to protect a structure? And realize, we are not here telling you to abandon your faith. Quite the opposite. We are talking about deepening, questioning, seeking to understand beyond the surface. Because the truth, when it is really true, does not fear being investigated. And perhaps that is exactly what Jesus wanted. Maybe he didn't want blind followers, but conscious people. People who sought, who knocked, who asked, as he himself taught. Because whoever seeks, finds. But you only find those who are willing to look beyond what was delivered ready-made. The now, as we move forward, we will begin to analyze even more specific elements, texts, patterns, and details that may indicate that this idea did not come out of nowhere. There are records, there are interpretations, there are signs that point to something bigger happening behind the scenes in the spiritual history of humanity. And I want to ask you something important now, but only if you really feel like it makes sense to you. Write one of these phrases here in the comments. I want to go deeper, or the truth needs to appear. This helps bring this content to more people who are also looking for answers. And it also shows me that you are following this journey to the end. We are living exactly in the time when prophecies begin to be fulfilled before our eyes. But most people still walk in darkness, trapped in partial truths, carefully manipulated and hidden from humanity for centuries. Now think honestly, what if the very thing that was taken out from the scriptures contains the answers you have been seeking for years? Answers capable of strengthening your faith, illuminating your mission, and revealing the true purpose of Jesus' coming. That's why I prepared an absolutely revealing digital book. This is not just a book. It is a spiritual awakening, a tool created for those who feel that something has been erased from history and are ready to recover what religion has hidden, without filters, without fear, without manipulation. Download now. The link is in the first pinned comment. But be careful, as it contains spiritually sensitive content, it can be removed at any time, and there are very few active copies left. Don't wait for the world to collapse, to seek what your soul already knows it needs. Click now, download your copy, and allow this truth to begin to unfold within you. If you are one of the first to download, come back here and write just one word: Amen. This will be your act of faith, and today, God can open a door that you never knew was about to open. Now, to understand why this hypothesis makes such an impact, we first need to look honestly at what the traditional church teaches about the death of Jesus. Because most people grew up hearing the same explanation. Jesus came into the world to die for the sins of humanity, become the perfect sacrifice, and through his blood, offer redemption to men. This is the basis of the Christian faith taught in pulpits, catechisms, sermons, Bible studies, evangelisms, and practically the entire religious structure built around the cross. From early on, the message was summed up like this: man sinned, sin separated humanity from God, divine justice demanded reparation, and Jesus, as the Son of God, took that place to pay the debt that no one else could pay. This traditional view has a very strong internal logic. It talks about guilt, forgiveness, atonement, redemption, salvation, eternal life. It offers a clear answer to human anguish in the face of sin and death. And precisely because it is such a consolidated narrative, so repeated, so emotionally powerful, almost no one stops to ask whether it completely exhausts the meaning of Christ's mission. Almost no one asks whether the cross could have had more than one function. Almost no one dares to go beyond the ready-made formula. Because for a long time, questioning details of this interpretation was seen as rebellion, heresy, lack of faith, or even a spiritual threat. But there is a huge difference between denying Jesus and trying to understand more deeply what Jesus really came to do. When the church teaches that Jesus was the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, it focuses all its attention on one main axis: sacrifice for sins. In this structure, the cross is presented as the absolute center of everything, almost always explained in legal and moral terms. The human being made a mistake. God is holy. Justice needs to be satisfied. Jesus takes the punishment. The sinner is forgiven. And without a doubt, this reading is present in many New Testament texts. It's not about pretending it doesn't exist. The point here is different. Was this reading presented as the complete story, when perhaps it was just the most accepted, most controllable, and easiest to institutionalize part? Because realize something very important. When a religion organizes the entire understanding of faith around a single interpretative key, it also defines what can and cannot be investigated. It defines the allowed questions. It establishes which texts should be read in a certain way. It creates a frame, and within this framework, Jesus appears primarily as a sacrificial victim. But did he come just to die? Does your mission end in vicarious suffering? Could it be that his entire life, his confrontations, his speeches, his clashes with the religious system, his rabolas, his revelation about the Father, was all this just a path to the sacrifice? Or was it part of something much broader? This is where the contrast starts to get really powerful. Because if you look closely, the way Jesus spoke about God does not always match the religious imagery that was inherited from certain readings of the Old Testament. Jesus speaks of intimacy, of truth, of light, of liberation, of knowing the Father. He not only demands obedience, it invites awakening. He doesn't just talk about guilt. He talks about seeing, hearing, discerning, being born again, knowing the truth. And this is very strong because it reveals that Christ's mission did not seem limited to a simple spiritual payment. There was something revelatory in everything he did. There was confrontation. There was exposure. There were unmasking of structures. There was a constant tension between the truth he brought and the religious system that claimed to represent God. The traditional view of the Church also teaches redemption of humanity. This means that, through the death and resurrection of Jesus, humanity would once again have access to reconciliation with God. This message is central to Christianity and moves crowds to this day. But once again, the necessary question is not whether there is redemption. The question is, redemption from what exactly? Just moral guilt? Just from personal sin? Just the final destination after death? Or also a system of spiritual blindness, religious domination, false images about God, invisible structures of consciousness control? Because if humanity has been redeemed, perhaps it has also been called to awaken. And awakening is dangerous for any system that survives on fear, blind dependence, and undiscerning obedience. This is precisely why some alternative readings claim that Jesus came not only to absolve human guilt, but to reveal a deeper spiritual prison. And it is at this point that the word Archon begins to gain weight, not as an exotic curiosity or a marginal detail, but as a possible clue to understanding why so many layers of human spiritual experience seem marked by fear, guilt, imposition, and confusion. If the traditional church emphasized sacrifice and redemption, that doesn't necessarily mean it lied about everything. It could mean, however, that she cut the story. It could mean that she preserved one part and silenced another. It may mean that what was easier to transform into doctrine, right, guilt, and institutional control was repeated with force, while what required direct confrontation with certain structures was left in the background. And here comes a very serious perception. A faith entirely based on institutional mediation tends to depend less on direct revelation and more on authorized interpretation. But Jesus, in many moments, seems to do exactly the opposite movement. He breaks religious monopolies. He exposes hypocrisies. He dismantles appearances. He confronts those who use the sacred to maintain power over people. So when the church says, Jesus died for sins, the question that begins to echo is, yes, but is that all? When she says, the cross brought redemption, the question comes back with more force. Redemption from which prison? When she states, the blood of Christ reconciled man with God, another even deeper question arises. Which God did people think they were dealing with before this full revelation of the Father through Jesus? Do you notice how the terrain starts to shift? Because we are no longer just talking about devotional theology. We are talking about the possibility that Christ's mission included exposing an ancient spiritual distortion, deeply ingrained in Scripture, tradition, and the way humanity has been taught to fear the divine. And maybe that's exactly why this topic bothers so much. Because he moves Jesus from the place of just a sacrificial victim and also presents him as a revealer, a confrontationist, an expositor of the truth, someone who enters history not only to suffer, but to show something that was hidden. And if this is only part of the history that the church has preserved, then the other part may be the most explosive, the part that doesn't fit easily into rigid systems, the part that deals with authority, tradition, spiritual control, and official interpretation. The part that forces the listener to think, compare, discern, and ask if the image they received from God was complete or filtered. This is why, going forward, we need to look not just at what was taught, but at what may have been omitted. And when we start to notice the signs, the contrasts, the ruptures, and the messages that appear between the lines, you will see why so many people believe that the cross was not just atonement, but also exposure. If you have been following this far, comment at the end of one of these sentences, "This is not the complete story," or "I want to see what was omitted," because the next step will involve precisely those pieces that for a long time were hidden behind the best-known version. And this is exactly where we begin to get into one of the most intriguing and perhaps most ignored parts of this entire discussion. Because when you start looking directly at the scriptures, without automatic filters, without ready-made interpretations being imposed, some differences begin to emerge in an almost uncomfortable way. Differences that do not appear when you read superficially, but that become evident when you carefully compare the God presented in the Old Testament with the God that Jesus reveals. And the question that begins to echo is simple, but extremely powerful. Why did Jesus never describe God in the same way as the Old Testament? Think about it calmly. In the Old Testament, in many moments, God is presented as a figure of absolute authority, who demands strict obedience, who punishes severely, who establishes harsh laws and, in some cases, executes collective judgments. There are episodes of destruction, wars, exemplary punishments, and a relationship often based on fear and submission. This is the picture that many people carry in their minds when they think of the ancient God. Now compare this to how Jesus talks about God. Jesus calls God Father, not just Father, but a loving, close, accessible Father. A Father who knows each person, who cares, who forgives, who seeks the lost. Instead of fear, he talks about love. Instead of punishment, he speaks of mercy. Instead of distance, he talks about relationships. And that's not a small detail. That's a huge shift in perspective. And the more you observe, the more this difference begins to draw attention. Why did Jesus never emphasize divine wrath in the same way? Why didn't he reinforce the need for sacrifices like in the old system? Why did he often confront religious leaders who strictly followed Old Testament laws? And most importantly, why did he seem to reveal something new, something deeper, something that wasn't being fully understood before? In John 14:9, for example, Jesus says, "He who has seen me has seen the Father." Now think about the weight of that statement. If Jesus is the perfect revelation of the Father, then everything he demonstrates, love, compassion, forgiveness, closeness, should reflect the true nature of God. But this raises an inevitable question. Does this image fully correspond to the God who appears in all Old Testament accounts? Or is there a tension that needs to be analyzed more carefully? And it doesn't stop there. At several moments, Jesus not only presents a different vision, he directly confronts old interpretations. He says, "You have heard what was said, but I tell you," and that is extremely significant, because it is not just a repetition of the law, it is a reformulation, an elevation, a correction of understanding, as if something was being adjusted, revealed more clearly. Now stop and reflect. If everything was already perfectly understood before, why would this type of correction be necessary? And this is where this first clue begins to gain strength. Because maybe Jesus wasn't just teaching new commandments. Maybe he was revealing a purer, truer, less distorted understanding of God. And if that's true, then another possibility automatically arises. What if the previous image wasn't complete? What if part of it was influenced, shaped, or even controlled? It is at this point that some schools of thought begin to connect this difference with the idea of Archons. If there are entities or forces that influence humanity's spiritual perception, then one of the most effective forms of control would be precisely to shape the image of God. Because when you control how someone sees God, you control how that person lives, obeys, fears, and positions themselves spiritually. And now everything starts to come together in an unsettling way. A God associated with fear, constant guilt, punishment, keeps people submissive. A God revealed as love, truth, and liberation awakens awareness, freedom, and questioning. And which of these two views did Jesus reinforce? This doesn't mean completely ignoring the Old Testament, but it does mean that it may need to be read in a new light, a light that comes precisely from what Jesus revealed. Because if he is the maximum expression of truth, then it is through him that everything must be interpreted. And perhaps this is exactly what has never been explored as deeply as it should. Perhaps the key is not in choosing a side, but in realizing that there is a progressive revelation. And within that progression, something was exposed. Something has been brought to light. Something that was previously hidden or misunderstood. And the more you start to look at these differences, the harder it becomes to ignore that there is something here that needs to be investigated in more depth. So tell me something. Have you noticed this difference before? Or is this starting to open your mind now? If this is making sense to you, comment at the end something like, "I never realized that," or "Now everything starts to make sense." Because in the next step, we're going to get directly into the origins of this concept and understand who, or what, these so-called Archons really are, and why this can completely change the way you see this whole story. And now we come to a point that, for many people, has never even been mentioned, but which may be one of the most important pieces of this entire puzzle. Because after realizing that there is a possible difference between the God presented in the Old Testament and the Father revealed by Jesus, the need to understand naturally arises. If there is a distortion, who would be behind it? This is where a term almost unknown to most appears, but extremely relevant within some ancient traditions: Archons. Maybe this word sounds strange to you now, but its meaning can completely change the way you see spirituality. The word Archon comes from the Greek archon, which literally means ruler, authority, or dominator. And within certain ancient texts, especially linked to Gnostic thought, Archons are described as spiritual entities that exert influence over the world, not only in a physical way but mainly at the level of the mind, perception, and human consciousness. Now pay close attention to this, because this is profound. These Archons are not presented simply as demons in the traditional sense. They are described as forces that act in subtle ways, shaping the way people see spiritual reality. In other words, they don't have to appear directly. They influence ideas. They distort perceptions. They create systems. They support structures that keep humanity trapped in a limited vision of truth. And if this is real, it completely changes the game. Because we're no longer just talking about sin and salvation, we're talking about spiritual control. We are talking about the possibility that humanity may have been guided over time to believe in incomplete or distorted versions of the truth, without realizing it. Within some Gnostic texts, such as those found in Nag Hammadi, Archons are associated with a kind of system that keeps humanity in spiritual ignorance. Not simple ignorance, but a profound blindness, where people believe they are seeing the truth, when in fact, they are only seeing a part of it. And now connect this with everything we've seen so far. If Jesus came to bring the truth, and said that the truth will set you free, from what exactly? Just from sin, or also from an illusion of a system, in a way of seeing God that is not completely true? And if the Archons are linked to this system, then it makes sense to think that the greatest form of control is not physical, it is spiritual and mental. Think with me. If you control what a person believes about God, you control their behavior, their decisions, their fears, the way they live. You don't need to physically arrest someone, just shape their view of spiritual reality. And that's exactly what makes this concept so powerful, and at the same time so little discussed. Because if that's true, then spiritual warfare doesn't just happen in the unseen. It happens inside the human mind. The way you understand God, Jesus, salvation, sin, all of this may have been influenced by something bigger. And now the question starts to get even more serious. What if Jesus knew this? What if part of his mission was precisely to expose this system, reveal these influences, show that there is something beyond what was taught? This would explain why he talked so much about seeing, hearing, understanding. This would explain why he said that many had eyes but did not see, ears but did not hear, as if there was a kind of veil, something preventing people from perceiving the complete truth. And perhaps this veil is directly linked to this concept. The Archons within these traditions do not necessarily want to destroy humanity. They want to maintain control. And the most effective control is not through force. It is through belief. It's making people accept a version of reality without question. It's making them believe that they already know everything, when there is still a lot to be revealed. And that is exactly why this subject causes so much discomfort, because it messes with the base. It messes with what was considered absolute for a long time. It raises the possibility that not everything has been revealed in the purest form, and that there is something beyond, something deeper, something that Jesus may have come to show. Rare, but we are still just beginning to understand this, because in the next steps, we will begin to directly connect this concept with the scriptures, with Jesus' speeches, with patterns that may indicate that this influence is not just theory, but something that has left clear marks throughout spiritual history. Now I want to ask you something very direct. Have you ever heard about Archons before? Or is this completely new to you? Comment at the end of one of these phrases. This is new to me, or I already suspected that, because this helps me understand how far you have come on this journey, and prepares the ground for what comes next. Now we come to one of the most delicate, most provocative, and most difficult points to approach with intellectual and spiritual honesty. Because after talking about the Archons as possible hidden spiritual rulers, a question arises that many people avoid even asking, but which is at the center of this entire investigation. What if the God described in parts of the Old Testament is not exactly the same Father of love revealed by Jesus? I'm not saying this as a closed statement nor as an absolute truth imposed on you. What we are doing here is raising hypotheses, comparing patterns, observing characteristics, noticing tensions that exist in the biblical text itself, and asking, seriously, do these characteristics reflect the God of love preached by Jesus? Because it is impossible to deny that in many passages of the Old Testament, the image presented is that of a severe, jealous, punitive, centralizing, demanding authority. which governs by rigid law, the threat of punishment, and the constant demonstration of power. There are destruction orders. There are collective punishments. There is fear as an element of submission. There is a language of absolute dominance that marks the experience of an entire people. And what makes this even more intense is the fact that, for millions of people, this image has been accepted without question as being the direct and perfect revelation of the supreme God. But when Jesus enters the scene, the atmosphere changes. The vocabulary changes. The way of approaching God changes. The center stops being fear and becomes love. The focus stops being punishment and becomes mercy. Logic stops being just obedience out of fear and becomes transformation through truth. And this is where the discomfort begins, because comparison is inevitable. If Jesus is the visible image of the invisible God, if whoever sees Jesus sees the Father, if the fullness of divine revelation dwells in him, then everything that does not harmonize with his essence needs, at the very least, to be analyzed. Jesus welcomes, heals, forgives, restores, brings closer, teaches, reveals. He does not operate from the pleasure of punishing. He does not demonstrate an obsession with control. He does not form disciples through terror. On the contrary, he dispels fear, exposes religious hypocrisy, and confronts structures that use the name of God to dominate consciences. So the question comes back with more force. When we see, in certain ancient texts, a profile marked by anger, punishment, and control, are we really facing the same essence that Jesus revealed? Think about the anger. In the Old Testament, divine wrath appears repeatedly as a central force in the relationship between heaven and earth. God is angry, threatens, punishes, exterminates, sends plagues, destroys people, punishes deviations with extreme harshness. This image has built, over the centuries, a spirituality based on fear, guilt, and forced obedience. Many people don't love God, they just fear being punished by him. Many people are not looking for intimacy, they are looking for spiritual survival. But when Jesus speaks of the Father, he does not lead people into this atmosphere of terror. He shows a God who makes the sun rise on the just and the unjust, who searches for the lost sheep, who welcomes the prodigal son, who prefers mercy to sacrifice. This does not eliminate the entire notion of justice, but it completely changes its nature. Justice stops being an expression of fury and becomes inseparable from truth and love. Now think about the punishment. In the old system, punishment has an exemplary, collective, crushing function. A mistake can bring death, a disobedience can bring destruction, a failure can be met with extreme severity. This standard is very important because it establishes a spirituality of vigilance and submission. Obey or suffer the consequences. But Jesus doesn't teach his disciples to relate to the Father like that. He doesn't raise terrified children. He forms followers who need to know the truth, remain in the light, discern the heart, love their neighbors, forgive 70 times 7. Even when he confronts sin, he does so with a depth that seeks transformation, not mere intimidation. Then another inevitable question arises. Why is Jesus' spiritual pedagogy so different from the pedagogy of fear that appears in so many ancient passages? And then we come to control, perhaps the most sensitive mark of all. Spiritual control does not need present itself as explicit evil. He often dresses in sacred authority. It demands total submission, monopolizes mediation with the divine, dictates detailed rules, restricts access to truth, centralizes power in a structure that claims to speak in the name of God. And when you look at certain religious systems in the Old Testament, especially in their strictest readings, you see how this pattern can be used to dominate consciences. The individual does not know directly. He depends on authority. He does not discern freely. He obeys. He is not moved by revelation. He moves out of fear of transgression. Now compare this with Jesus tearing symbolic veils, dismantling the pride of experts in the law, calling God Father, teaching that the kingdom is near, that the truth sets free, that the pure in heart will see God. This doesn't just seem like a simple continuation of the previous system. It often seems like a direct confrontation with a spiritual control structure. This is why some scholars, mystics, and more alternative reading schools raise the hypothesis that certain manifestations attributed to God in the Old Testament could, in fact, reflect the actions of an inferior entity, a limited spiritual ruler, an Archon, not the supreme and absolute God revealed in fullness by Jesus, but a smaller, authoritarian power that wishes to be worshipped, obeyed and feared, as if it were the final source of everything. Within certain Gnostic traditions, this figure is exactly like this, an arrogant, jealous, domineering authority who presents himself as the only divinity, but is not the fullness of the true Father. And when you first hear it, it may seem radical, but when you start comparing patterns, the hypothesis stops sounding absurd and starts to seem, at the very least, researchable. Once again, it is important to remain honest. We are not here dogmatically asserting the God of the Old Testament is an Archon. We are saying that there are characteristics in certain texts that raise this possibility of reading for some thinkers, and the reason for this is simple: excessive anger, exemplary punishment, demand for submission, obsession with control, centralization of worship, constant threat. These marks, when compared to the revelation of love, truth, compassion, and freedom brought by Jesus, create a friction that cannot be ignored. And perhaps the big question is not to discard the Old Testament, but to recognize that it may contain layers, disputes of perception, records of a humanity trying to understand the divine in the midst of complex spiritual influences. Maybe that's why Jesus talks so much about knowing the Father, because knowing the Father is not just accepting an inherited religious definition. It's discerning, it's understanding, it's going from letter to revelation, it's getting out of fear and into the truth. It is to stop serving out of compulsion and start living out of spiritual awareness. And this is fundamental because an Archon does not want awakened children, wants controlled servos. An Archon doesn't want intimacy, wants submission. An Archon does not want inner freedom, want dependency. So when Jesus reveals a God who loves, welcomes, calls, enlightens, and liberates, he is not just teaching something beautiful. He may be dismantling a false, or at least incomplete, image that has kept entire generations trapped in a limited understanding of the divine. Also notice how this explains Jesus' clash with the religious authorities of his time. They advocated a system heavily based on law, ritual purity, exclusion, guilt, and sacred power. Jesus enters this scenario and begins to heal on the Sabbath, touch the unclean, forgive sinners, sit with marginalized people, challenge official interpreters, expose hypocrisies. This doesn't seem like simple maintenance of an old structure. It feels like the breaking of a cycle. It looks like the entry of a light that disorganizes an entire system. And if this system was somehow aligned with a spiritual controlling force, then it makes even more sense to think that Jesus' mission included exposing this reality. Of course, many people will resist this idea because it touches on centuries of tradition, with established interpretations, with spiritual comfort zones. And this discomfort is understandable. But ignoring tension doesn't eliminate it. The differences are still there. The contrast between fear and love is still there. Between punishment and mercy. Between control and freedom. Between a God who demands sacrifices and a Father revealed by Jesus who desires truth within. And it is precisely in this tension that the Archon hypothesis gains strength as a reading tool, not to destroy faith but to deepen it and force the mind to go beyond the surface. Because perhaps the most important question is not simply, who is right, but which image of God produces more truth, more life, more freedom, more coherence with Jesus? If the answer always takes us back to love, compassion, light, and liberation, so this already says a lot about which revelation takes priority. And the further we go, the more necessary it becomes to investigate how Jesus not only announced salvation, but confronted the very system that kept people trapped in distorted images of the sacred. If this moved you, comment on one of these phrases at the end. This needs to be investigated, or Jesus God is different, because in the next section, we will enter precisely into the real mission of Jesus within this alternative reading. And that is where the pieces begin to move in an even stronger way. And it is exactly here that everything begins to change in an even more profound way. Because if until now we raised doubts, comparisons, and possibilities, now we enter a perspective that can completely redefine the role of Jesus in the spiritual history of humanity. Because what if Jesus didn't just come to save, but to reveal? This phrase may seem simple, but it carries a huge weight. Because for centuries, the main emphasis has always been placed on the idea of salvation. Jesus died for sin, the sacrifice, the redemption, the cross as the final point. But what if the cross was not the end, but rather the most intense moment of a revelation that had been happening since the beginning of his ministry? Think with me. Even before the crucifixion, what did Jesus do? He taught. He revealed. He confronted. He woke up. He wasn't just preparing the way to die. He was constantly opening people's eyes. And this was not something secondary. It was central. Jesus talked about truth all the time. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. This phrase in itself already raises a very strong question. Freedom from what exactly? Only from sin, or also from spiritual ignorance? Of illusion? From a distorted perception of reality? Because liberation implies that there is some kind of prison. And this prison, perhaps, is not only moral, but also mental and spiritual. Now connect this with everything we've seen so far. If there is a possibility that humanity has been influenced by an incomplete or distorted view of God, then Jesus' mission takes on a new dimension. He didn't just come to pay a spiritual debt. He came to expose something. He came to show what was hidden. He came to reveal the true Father, not just talk about him. And this completely changes the way you see every word, every action, every confrontation of Jesus. Because he didn't just teach, he debunked. He exposed religious leaders. He broke rigid traditions. He ignored rules that were used to control people. He showed that many religious practices had no real connection with divine truth. This doesn't just seem like the behavior of someone who has come to fulfill a sacrifice. This seems like someone who has come to reveal a profound error. And perhaps this error was not just human, but structural. Jesus constantly talked about seeing and not seeing. He said that many had eyes but could not see. This doesn't just seem like a simple metaphor. It seems like a spiritual diagnosis, as if people were living within a kind of blindness, believing they understood God, when in fact, they were limited to an incomplete vision. What if this blindness was maintained by something or someone? This is where the idea of Archons connects directly with the mission of Jesus, because if there are forces that influence humanity's spiritual perception, then the greatest threat to that system would be someone who reveals the truth, someone who wakes people up, someone who breaks control. And that's exactly what Jesus did. He didn't just talk about God, he showed God. He didn't just talk about freedom, he freed. He didn't just talk about truth, he was the truth. And maybe that's why his presence was so uncomfortable. Because control systems don't have a problem with religion, they have a problem with revelation. Religion can be organized, controlled, structured, but the truth sets you free. And when someone starts to see, they can no longer be led in the same way. Now think about it in depth. If Jesus came to reveal, then his death could have been a consequence of that revelation. Not just a sacrificial plan, but the result of confronting something that needed to be exposed, something that could not remain hidden. This completely changes the perspective. The cross stops being just an act of redemption and also becomes a breaking point, a moment when the truth collides with the system, a moment when what was hidden begins to come to light, even if it comes at a price. And perhaps that price was inevitable, because when you reveal something that is being kept hidden, you become a threat. And Jesus was exactly that, a threat, not to people, but to the system. And now, everything starts to do even more sense. Why was he rejected? Why was he persecuted? Why did his words bother him so much? Maybe it wasn't just because he talked about salvation, but because he revealed something that shouldn't be revealed. And if that's true, then we need to look at everything he said with a new perspective, not just as spiritual teachings, but as clues, like fragments of a greater truth, as signs that there is something beyond the traditional narrative. And that takes us to an even deeper point. If Jesus came to reveal, what exactly was hidden? This is the question that is beginning to form now, and that will take us directly to the next elements of this investigation. Because there are records, there are texts, there is evidence that points to possible concealment throughout history. But before I continue, I want to hear from you. Is this changing the way you see Jesus? If this made sense to you, comment at the end of one of these phrases. Jesus came to reveal, or I want to understand the complete truth. And now, we come to a point that is perhaps the most sensitive of all, because after considering the possibility that Jesus came not just to save, but to reveal, a question inevitably arises that changes everything. If this truth exists, why would it have been hidden? And this is where we need to talk about something that goes beyond theology, something that involves structure, influence, and power, because throughout history, faith has never been just spiritual, it has also been institutional. And every institution needs control. Now think with me calmly, without rejecting immediately, just observing the patterns. If a religious institution builds its entire foundation on a specific narrative, for example, the central idea that Jesus died for sin and that salvation depends exclusively on the interpretation taught by that institution, then any variation, any deepening, any revelation beyond that becomes a threat. Because whoever controls the narrative controls the faith, and whoever controls faith controls people. This doesn't mean everything was created with bad intentions from the start, but it does mean that over time, systems form, and systems need to maintain themselves. They need to preserve authority, avoid excessive questioning, keep the structure intact, and the most effective way to do this is not through force, it is through belief. If people believe they already have the whole truth, they stop searching. If they believe that questioning is dangerous, they stop thinking. If they believe that everything has already been revealed, they stop seeing. And this creates a perfect scenario to maintain a stable narrative. Now connect this with what we've seen so far. If Jesus came to reveal something deeper, something that would free consciences, something that could break structures of spiritual control, then it makes sense that this part of the mission would not be widespread, because revelation generates freedom, and freedom is not easily controlled. Throughout history, numerous texts have been deleted, considered apocryphal, labeled as dangerous, or simply ignored. And we're not talking about a few documents. We're talking about dozens of ancient writings that presented different views, deeper perspectives, less controlled interpretations about Jesus, about God, and about spiritual reality itself. Now the question starts to get even more direct. Who decided what should go in and what should stay out? Who defined which texts would be considered official and which would be discarded? And most importantly, based on what? Because when you look at the formation of the biblical canon, you realize that there were human decisions, councils, debates, choices, and every choice involves criteria and interests, not always negative interests, but interests that reflect the dominant vision of that moment. What if, in this process, important parts of the message were left aside? What if certain teachings that pointed to a deeper liberation were not convenient for the structure that was being built? This is not an accusation. It is a reflection. Because throughout history, whenever knowledge emerges that challenges the system, it tends to be rejected, discredited, or hidden. This doesn't just happen in religion. It happens in different areas of society. The new is uncomfortable. The different threatens. What cannot be controlled needs to be neutralized. And perhaps that is exactly what happened here. If Jesus' mission included expounding something, revealing a truth that would free people from limited vision, then that part of the message could have been softened, reinterpreted, or even ignored in favor of a simpler, more acceptable, easier to organize version. Because it is much easier to teach that Jesus died for sins than to explain that he came to expose a system complex spiritual. It's much easier to keep people focused on guilt and forgiveness than it is to get them to question the very fabric of spiritual reality. It is much easier to control a faith based on fear than to deal with a faith based on conscience. And that's why this discussion is so powerful, and at the same time, so avoided. Because it doesn't just change ideas, it changes structures. It interferes with what has been established as absolute truth. It opens up space for questions that many never have the courage to ask. And perhaps the biggest of these questions is, what else hasn't been told? If part of Jesus' mission was hidden, what exactly was left out of the main narrative? What details were left out? What messages were considered too dangerous to teach openly? And that's exactly what we're going to start exploring from here. Because there are texts, records, and evidence that point to a much deeper vision, much more provocative, and that can connect all these pieces in a way you've never seen before. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe there is something that has been hidden throughout history? Or do you think everything has already been completely revealed? Comment at the end of one of these phrases. The truth was hidden, or I want to discover everything. And it is exactly at this point that the story begins to become even more intriguing. Because when we talk about things that may have been hidden, ignored, or left aside, we inevitably come to a topic that generates enormous curiosity and at the same time a lot of silence: the apocryphal Gospels and the so-called forbidden texts. Maybe you've heard this term before, or maybe you haven't. But the simple fact that there are texts about Jesus that were not included in the Bible raises a powerful question. Why? Why were some writings accepted and others rejected? And more importantly, What exactly did these texts say that was not considered official? Because here's a detail that few people realize. These texts are not modern inventions. Many of them are ancient, some dating back to the first centuries after Jesus, and were written by people who also claimed to preserve teachings, traditions, and revelations linked to the life and message of Christ. And among these texts, two stand out impressively: the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Judas. And this is where everything starts to take on a new dimension. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, does not present Jesus in the same way we are used to seeing him. He does not focus on the crucifixion. He does not emphasize the sacrifice for sins, but rather on the direct teachings of Jesus. There are phrases, statements, profound revelations, many of them enigmatic, that revolve around a central concept: inner knowledge, the discovery of truth within oneself, spiritual awakening. Now think about it. A text attributed to someone close to Jesus that does not place the cross as its center, but rather knowledge, consciousness, revelation. This completely changes the focus. In several passages, the idea conveyed is that the kingdom of God is not outside, but within. That truth is not just something to be accepted, but something to be discovered. That there is a kind of spiritual awakening that frees the individual from a condition of ignorance. And this connects directly with what we saw before. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. But free from what? Maybe from a limited vision. Maybe of a system. Maybe of something that keeps people unaware of the complete reality. Now let's move on to another even more controversial text, the Gospel of Judas. This, perhaps, is one of the most shocking of all, because in it, Judas does not appear as the classic traitor. On the contrary, in some interpretations, Judas is presented as someone who received special understanding from Jesus, as someone who participated in something that was part of a larger plan. And this completely changes the traditional narrative. Now stop and think. If even the figure of Judas can be reinterpreted, what else can have been seen in just one way? And once again, this does not mean that one version is 100% right and the other 100% wrong. The point here is to realize that there are multiple layers, multiple interpretations, multiple possibilities that have been reduced to a single dominant narrative. And that brings us back to the central idea. There are texts that show a different Jesus, a Jesus more focused on revealing than just saving, a Jesus who talks about awakening, consciousness, spiritual knowledge, a Jesus who seems to be trying to wake people up, not just forgive them. And if these texts were left out, the question comes back with even more force. Why? Were they too dangerous? Did they bring ideas that were difficult to control? Did they encourage people to search for themselves instead of relying on others? A structure? Because one thing is certain, a teaching based solely on obedience is easier to organize, but a teaching based on awakening is impossible to control. And perhaps that is exactly why these texts were marginalized, labeled, removed from the center of traditional faith. But still, they survived. And today, they are available. And when you start reading, comparing, connecting, something starts to happen. The pieces start to fall into place. Doubts begin to arise. And what previously seemed absolute begins to be questioned. And that's not a negative thing. This is the beginning of a deeper understanding, because the truth does not weaken when questioned, it grows stronger. And maybe that's exactly what's happening here. Now tell me something. Have you heard of these texts before? Or is this opening up a new perspective for you now? Comment at the end something like, "I didn't know that," or "I want to read these texts." And it is precisely at this point that many people begin to realize that perhaps there is something much deeper going on within the scriptures themselves. Because when someone reads the Bible only quickly, devotionally or literally, a lot goes unnoticed. But when reading becomes more attentive, more comparative, more sensitive to patterns, repetitions, changes in tone, symbolic images, and apparent tensions between passages, a new scenario begins to emerge. And this scenario raises a question that can completely transform the way you see the sacred text. What if the Bible is more of a code than a literal book? Think about that for a moment. For centuries, most people have been taught to read the Bible as a closed set of facts, stories, commandments, and doctrines, as if everything was there, on the surface, ready to be understood in the same way by anyone. But is it really? Because the more you delve into the scriptures, the more you realize that they speak in layers. There is historical narrative, yes, There is moral teaching, without a doubt. There is prophecy, there is poetry, there is parable, there is metaphor, there is vision, there is dream, there is apocalyptic language, there are spiritual codes, there are repeated symbols, and there are words that, depending on how they are read, open up completely different meanings. And that is exactly why biblical contradictions become such an important sign. Because when you encounter passages that seem to clash, you have two choices. Either assume that the text is confusing and stop there, or understand that perhaps these tensions are clues that there is more than one reading level. Perhaps the apparent contradiction is actually a door. Perhaps it is there to force the reader to leave the surface. Perhaps it is an invitation to discern. See how this happens at various points. There are times when God seems close, loving, compassionate, patient. In others, it appears harsh, destructive, jealous, demanding. In some passages, the emphasis is on mercy. In others, in punishment. In some, the path seems to be love. In others, absolute fear. Jesus summarizes the law in love for God and neighbor, but there are ancient passages marked by a logic of exclusion, violence, and exemplary punishment. What to do with this? Ignore, saying that everything is exactly the same, or admit that perhaps we are faced with voices, stages, perceptions, and layers that cannot be compressed into a simplistic reading. When you begin to see these tensions as signs, the text stops being just a sequence of religious phrases and starts to function as a field of revelation. And that's where hidden interpretations come in. Not in the sense of inventing anything, but in the sense of recognizing that many ancient texts, especially sacred ones, were written to be read on more than one level. The surface speaks to the crowd. Depth speaks to the seeker. This even appears in the way Jesus taught. He spoke in parables. He spoke in such a way that some people only heard the story, while others understood the mystery behind the story. This in itself shows us that spiritual truth is not always delivered in a direct and linear way. Often it is veiled, symbolic, provocative. And if Jesus taught like this, why imagine that the rest of the scriptures should only be read literally? Perhaps this is precisely one of the great limitations that prevented many people from realizing what was in front of their eyes all the time. Because symbolic language is not an accessory to the Bible, it is part of your structure. Water, fire, light, darkness, bread, wine, serpent, lamb, desert, mountain, temple, veil, throne, star, abyss, city, bride, dragon. None of this appears by chance. These elements are not just pretty figures. They carry spiritual messages, patterns of consciousness, invisible conflicts, inner states, clashes between truth and illusion. Now imagine the following. If the Bible really operates as a spiritual code in many moments, then reading everything literally could be the way to miss the deeper message. And this makes even more sense within the theme we are exploring. Because if there is something hidden, something revealed only to those who observe more carefully, then the symbolic structure of the text itself would serve as protection and at the same time, as a filter. Protection so that the message would not be completely destroyed. Filter so that only those who are truly looking for it will notice. This is why certain passages seem strange at first glance. Certain words of Jesus sound enigmatic. Certain prophetic visions seem indecipherable. Certain contradictions cannot be resolved with quick explanations. And perhaps this happens because the Bible was not made to just be consumed. It was made to be deciphered, not in the sense of turning everything into an occult secret, but in the sense of accepting that there is depth, structure, intentionality, and spiritual layers beyond the most common religious reading. Also think about the apocalypse. If one reads that text as if it were just a literal report of visible events, one inevitably gets lost or reduces everything to superficial speculation. But when you realize that there is intense symbolic language there, spiritual codes, images of power, empires, beasts, brands, thrones, seals, trumpets, women, dragons, and cosmic battles, then you understand that the message is more complex. The same goes for Daniel, Ezekiel, Zechariah, and so many others. The Bible speaks a lot in images, and images shape consciousness. They record truths in a way that a purely rational reading cannot reach. Now take this to the Gospels. How many times does Jesus say something that seems simple but carries multiple meanings? Born again. The kingdom is within you. You have eyes, but you do not see. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The truth will set you free. These phrases do not end on the surface. They point to an interior transformation, to a revelation that does not just fit into doctrine. And if Jesus spoke like this, then perhaps his own mission also needs to be read on more than one level. On the surface, redemption. In depth, revelation. On the surface, cross. In depth, exposure of structures. On the surface, forgiveness of sins. In depth, liberation from a system of spiritual blindness. And this is where the question gains even more force. What if the Bible is more of a code than a literal book? Not a code in the banal sense, as if every detail had an arbitrary secret key, but a code in the sense that it communicates through patterns, contrasts, symbols, repetitions, echoes, and layers of meaning. This would explain why so much seems to hide more than it shows. It would explain why certain passages bother you. It would explain why superficial readers and deep seekers come away with such different understandings of the same text. It would even explain why the dominant narrative has always preferred to simplify, because a text read only literally can be administered. It can be transformed into a rule, doctrine, institution, formula, but a text perceived as alive, symbolic, revelational, and provocative, this awakens consciousness. This one asks questions. This dismantles false certainties. This pushes the reader beyond religious dependence. And this, once again, returns us to the center of our investigation. If Jesus came to reveal, then it makes sense that the scripture itself carries marks of that revelation in layers, waiting for eyes that really want to see. The apparent contradictions, then, are no longer just problems. They become clues. Hidden interpretations no longer seem like exaggeration. They become a necessity. Symbolic language ceases to be ornament. It becomes a spiritual tool. And when these three things come together, contradictions, layers of interpretation, and symbols, the biblical text begins to look less like a linear book and more like a map of conflicts between light and darkness, between revelation and concealment, between the God revealed by Jesus and the images that may have been attributed to the divine by structures of control, fear, and power. Maybe that's why so many people read the Bible their whole lives and still feel like something doesn't quite add up, because deep down, they realize that there is something pulsing between the lines. There is something asking to be seen. There is a pattern wanting to emerge. And when this pattern starts to appear, you can no longer read like you used to. You start to notice recurring words. You begin to notice inversions. He begins to notice the clash between letter and spirit, between religion and truth, between blind obedience and an awakened conscience. You begin to notice that perhaps the text has always been deeper than we were allowed to believe. And this prepares us for the next movement of this journey, because if there is, there are signs that there is something deeper. So we need to ask who benefits when these signs remain invisible, who loses when people begin to read with discernment, and which specific passages begin to take on new meaning when the Bible stops being just a literal book and starts to be understood as a living, encoded, spiritually explosive message. If you've come this far and felt that this part opened your mind, comment on one of these phrases at the end. The Bible has layers, or I'm starting to see the code, because the next excerpt will precisely pick up on these signs and take the reading to an even more unsettling level.